Here we are in a 22-year-old democracy, and I just want to share with you some personal reflections of what I would call a racialized South Africa. I draw this concept of racialized from a text called Divided by Faith, written by Michael Emerson and Christian Smith. They talk about a racialized America, and they suggest that on a Sunday morning between the hours of 9 and 11, America is in its most divided state. Well, would this be so in South Africa? You think about it. When people go to their religious spaces of worship on Sundays, or maybe for some on Saturdays, how do our religious spaces of worship look like? Well, I'd like to suggest to you that you'd find this even in our professional spaces, our corporate spaces, our school spaces. That 22 years into our democracy in South Africa, we still largely are separated by race. There are those areas, though, that have become more multicultural or multiracial, and still, even in those areas, you can see how people have been able to either accept, based on class, what access we have or what access we do not have. And so as you think about this, I'd like you to think about, well, where does this play in my life, in my personal life, in my community life, and how does racism still play a serious role in my everyday world? Racism is a socially constructed reality. And economic bias is based on what we have inherited. We need to be questioning, where does our inheritance come from? How did it come about? There are many people who will talk about their merit. They have what they have because of hard work. They have what they have because they put their best foot forward. They have what they have because of their work etiquette or their work ethic. Well, I'd like you to think about that. Where does the money that you have from, or the access that you have to economic resources come from? Did you just get it because you're a hard worker? Did you just get it because you put your best foot forward? But how about when we think more closely and we magnify the reality that some of our access to economic resources or to resources that we need for our everyday living comes by our inheritance? So I'd like you to think about this now in the broader context of South Africa. There are those of us that today, in a 22-year-old democracy, those of us who have previously come from a background of a lack of economic resources, those of us that come from the diaspora of, if I can say this, the black diaspora, where we can talk about blacks, black Indians, black coloreds, and if you wouldn't mind, even black whites, especially in the south side of Johannesburg, those that know economic hardships that go back way back when, all the way to the apartheid regime. I'd like us to consider that racism is a social reality. More than it just being a social reality, it is a constructed social reality. What do I mean by this? Well, like somebody would build a building with brick and mortar and all the other things that you get to build up a wall, so is racism. It is socially constructed. People put pieces of puzzles together that give us what we call racism. Equally so, I'd like you to think about the reality that our economic resources are also part of this social construct, and it's what we have inherited. Whatever access you have and I have, somewhere down the line, it's not just about me, my hard work, my merit, my work etiquette. There has been an inheritance. Whether there has been an inheritance of much or of little, we need to ask ourselves the question, where does my economic resources come from? And in a South Africa where we are now, like I said, 22 years into our democracy, we need to take some time to look back to where we've come from and work out, those of us who have today maybe in a so-called middle-class existence, access economic resources, we need to say, well, how did I get to that place? Those of us who have a lot of economic resources, those of us who are the enfranchised, those of us who in a previous time in South Africa, before 22 years of democracy, we that know money and old money has come with us from a long way back. We need to be true to this reality that some of our economic resource, some of the gain that we have is not just all about our own personal work. There's something linked to our inheritance. What about those then that don't have much? In fact, they were left out in the past, they left out currently in the present, and as we look into a future, it seems like they still remain the marginalized. Who am I talking about? I'm talking to us about largely the 18 to 25 million people in our country that still remain in the margins. Those people who earn less than 1,200 Rand a month. Those people who are left outside the gravy train of our democracy. So please consider this. There are some of us that are in the 22 years of a democracy. We know about lack. We know about a social existence where there was less when it came to economic resources. But in 22 years, we've grown our access to money. We've grown our access to resources. I'd call us those that were previously disenfranchised. But in the last 22 years, and even in our current democracy, we've grown ourselves. And so we are now sharing with the enfranchised. When I talk about the enfranchised, I want you to think about those of us that had some way back when. We know that even in the years before our democracy, meaning in our apartheid era, we had. We were those who were favored by economic access. And even now, in the last 22 years, we remain in this kind of favor. I like to quote right here in this moment the story of Reverend Dr. Gerry Libbe. He passed away this year on the 7th of January. This is one of my mentors and really someone that I respected. And some years ago, when he came to visit us on a project in the States at Bethel University, Dr. Gerry Libbe said this, and this was back in 2009. He said the problem with our democracy is that nothing has seemed to change in his life. But he said that's not the clear, stark problem or issue. The main issue is that while nothing has changed in his economic life, also very little changed for the large majority of our people that are without, that were without, remain without, and possibly if we don't change our future, will remain without. They will still remain outside the gravy train of our so-called democracy. We need to have a courageous conversation. This courageous conversation needs to be about the realities of economic imbalance that prevails in our country, but it also needs to be about the way in which we treat other people in a conscious and an unconscious way. Well, let's get more practical. What are the conversations we are having around our dinner tables? How are people articulating their political views? How are we talking about the other, whoever the other might be? Especially those who are the racialized other. How are we talking about those of a different gender? So how do men talk about women? How do black people talk about white people? How do Indian people talk about colored people? How do colored people talk about white people? Well, let's extend it a bit further, because this diversity in our South Africa is a bit broader than just race. It's got to do with what Howard Thurman would call the three descriptors that we need to look at when we are addressing a social reality. Well, we talk about race, gender, and class. We can't do much in our current South Africa if it only remains as a black and white issue, because this is what we need to consider. What if people get over their racial issue but can't accept women? What if people get over their sexism issue but can't accept people because they come from a poor class or from a lack of resources? These are kind of things that we need to think about in us having a courageous conversation. I'd encourage us in our home spaces, in our family spaces, in our work spaces, to open up the conversation where we can hopefully seek to understand the other, again, whoever the other might be, and start to work away in a better understanding of who they are and who we are and who we have the potential to be together. I hear a lot mentioned about authentic relationships, and I agree. We are able to find one another in our authentic relationships. But I want to be clear here. It's one thing for me to accept a person who is given the descriptor of being white as one person. But it's another thing for me to accept them and their family and their broader community. Let me flip the script very quickly. You might hear people talking about, my black friend, my Indian friend, my colored friend, and then not ever consider that that person, as a person, is connected to a family, and that family is connected to a community, and that community is connected to certain culture, to certain behaviors, to certain practices, to a certain economic class. And so we have the syndrome of, that's my good friend, or that's my good black friend, or my good white friend, or my good colored friend, or my good Indian friend. Well, this is the factor where we are only able to accept one, but leave out the many that that one is a part of. So yes, we're all for authentic relationships. But even in some of the most authentic relationships that I have developed in my walk with people that I've known for over 20 years, across our racial differences, across our cultural differences, across the divide of our language differences, across the divide of our religious differences, across the divide of our sexual orientation differences, across the divide of our nation identity differences. I've come to meet people from many spaces, and I'm grateful that over 20 years in the space of dealing with issues of difference, dealing with issues of racism, exclusion, social divides, in what I would call in the work and ministry of reconciliation, I've committed my life to knowing people more authentically. And so I'm all for authentic relationships. However, even in the most authentic relationships I have, myself and my colleagues have noted how difficult it is to remain courageous. When we say courageous, we talk about addressing the issues of the social divide without apologizing. Not becoming angry, not losing our head, but being able to talk about the difficulties that we see that continue to prevail in our society. Why? Because of the social differences that are constructed. The social difference of race, of class, of gender, of people that are living with disabilities or are enabled in their living arrangements. So where there's a lack of courage, what do we do? Well, we've got to work that courage up. We've got to build that courage up. We've got to find a consciousness, like Steve Biko would have suggested in his writings and the movement of black consciousness, which many people get worried about. Oh, you know, that seems like an aggressive voice, Steve Biko. I think the same could be said for Malcolm X, an aggressive voice. But let's just backstep into Steve Biko around black consciousness. It wasn't that radical what he was saying. His message was directed to a people within a social construct of legalized racism. And he spoke to largely black African people in South Africa about the beauty of who they are. Well, in a text called Black and Reformed, Alan Busak captures the words of Biko and extends it further to state, and I paraphrase, that this solidarity, or this consciousness rather, that Biko spoke about is a movement that calls us into solidarity with consciousness. It calls me to join in with this consciousness. It is a consciousness that is inviting to not only the black South African, but to the Indian South African, but as well to the colored South African and the white South African. This notion that we can build a consciousness of building a better society is for all of us. Well, leaning from that space, you know, what can we do then in practical measures? And here I'll bring a resource in from a well-known writer, and now being in the space of consulting. She writes a book called Fierce Conversations. Her name is Susan Scott. I've quite enjoyed the book. And it's really, I think what is so amazing about it is that there's this application of questions, of critical questions. I think even in one space, and I paraphrase, Susan Scott suggests that you can take on life one conversation at a time. But underpinning every conversation, there are some critical questions that we are asked. And she gives us a little formula that I like talking about, and she says it like this. She says, to be fierce, not to be angry, but to be bold. To be bold in the conversation, to be bold in the engagement of the other. These are 4 simple principles. And I like to say it like this. Say with me, IPTE. Well, if you got it right, I'm talking about IPTE, an acronym. I-P-T-E, IPTE. The I is for interrogate reality. Well, whatever the reality looks like, whoever the person within that reality is, whatever the social circumstances are, we need to look at it more closely. Don't just make a stereotype of that environment. Interrogate it. Find out about that space. Have the kind of enthusiasm, the kind of commitment to go deeper into the story. So I see this person and they seem like they are this. I see a person and they dressed like that. Before we get to the assumptions, let's go into that space and interrogate our assumptions, interrogate our stereotypes, interrogate the kind of things that we just take for granted and say, well, that's the status quo. That's got to be how it is. Well, interrogate it. Get deeper into that reality. Put on the magnifying glass and interrogate it. Go deeper and be enthused and ask questions. And you might be surprised that through that interrogation of that specific space and place and reality, you might learn a whole lot more. The next one that Susan Scott speaks about, she talks about provoking learning. So if I'm to be in this courageous conversation, I'm interrogating reality, then I'm provoking learning. Well, what's that about? I want to be in a space where I'm not just making statements. And the best way to do this is actually to ask questions. Many of us are giving advice all the time. We're saying what needs to happen. Well, how about we just step back? Even me talking to you right now, I might be talking too much. But if we step back and ask a question. So what do you think? What are your thoughts? These kind of questions are open-ended. It allows people to speak. It makes the connection more courageous. It allows even their ignorance to become present, or their arrogance. It allows a person's unconscious bias or their conscious bias to become present with us. And so we stop hiding behind ourselves. We're able to bring ourselves into the conversation in reality. So there's a provoking of learning, not a shutting down of conversation. We provoke learning. The other one is to tackle challenges, the T. So in having the sphere conversation, we're able to interrogate reality, provoke learning, and tackle challenges. Well, there's lots of challenges in our South Africa. But through the conversation, through our magnifying of the space, and then wanting to learn from it, we're able to take on the hurdles that our current South Africa provides us. Meaning that we have a resilience. Meaning that we're not just going to shut things out. We are wanting to find a resolve. We are wanting to be people that say, well, people say we can't do this, but we believe that we can. And so in a racialized South Africa that we've inherited, in a South Africa that is made complex by the kind of economic disenfranchised realities that people face, the kind of people that are without, we can actually see for ourselves that we are able to tackle these challenges that present themselves. Lastly, Susan Scott would say the E is for enriches relationships or enriching relationships. It's all about that, isn't it? When we're able to enter into this conversation, it interrogates reality, provokes learning, tackles challenges, and enriches relationships. When I step away from a racialized world that I see people that are disconnected, I see people that are hurting, I see people that are in pain. When I'm able to enter into that space knowing that I'm looking there, I'm investigating, I'm finding out, I'm interrogating, I'm provoking this learning, I'm tackling challenges because I want to find resolve. Ultimately, I want to bring people together. We want relationships to become stronger. We want people to connect. We want communities to connect. We want the rich and the poor to find a common ground. We want those that are the other, whatever the other they might think themselves to be, that they are able to come to a space where they are human and that their humanity is respected. And so as a close, take away your work that you would be able to do in interrogating reality, provoking learning, tackling challenges, and enriching relationships. And being committed within our racialized South Africa to actually have the courageous conversation that can bring people to a common ground. This common ground that ultimately one of our great social action and activist leaders would say is the beloved community. How can you become a part of the conversation? Well, invite somebody for a cup of tea, have some coffee time, bring people who are from different spaces, and have a respectful conversation where you together can interrogate reality, provoke learning, tackle challenges, and enrich relationships. This enriching of relationships can bring us to a common ground. A place where the I and the other set aside what they think for a moment or two and come into a new space where they are willing to be open to that which someone else is saying. a place and a space that Dr. Martin Luther King would say is the beloved community. A place and a space that Chung Yung Kyung would suggest is a place for us to build solidarity. A solidarity that's beyond our lazy pluralism. Well, whatever you are about to do and wish to do, I hope that you will join the conversation. The conversation that brings people to a common ground where we can close the gaps that divide us and build a better future for our South Africa, a better future for our Africa, and a better future for our world. Thank you very much.